Hello, this is Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute, and I'm very happy to have with me today Mary-Beth Long to discuss foreign policy issues in the incoming Trump administration and ideas regarding approaches, strategy for the troubled Middle East. Mary-Beth was a high-ranking Department of Defense official. She served in the Department of Defense between 2004 and 2009 as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, a Senate-confirmed position. She was also Principal Advisor to the Secretary on Strategy and Policy with responsibility for the Middle East, as well as Europe and Africa, and was Chairman of the high-level committee responsible for NATO's security policy, so involved in many of the issues that are still pressing today. After leaving the administration, since then she's been in the private sector, and she has her own company called Long and Associates, if I'm not mistaken.
MB Long and Associates.
MB Long and Associates. She was an advisor to the Mitt Romney campaign and was often quoted in these in this past campaign year as an expert on foreign policy, and she's still an advisor to NATO on many issues. We're very lucky to have you with us, Mary-Beth.
It's great to be here, Paul.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So I want to sort of divide our discussion into two parts. The first part is to look at the president-elect and his views or his instincts as it relates to foreign policy in the Middle East, what you can discern there, and as well as sort of looking at the team that has been assembled so far and what you make of his views and the views of his team, what that indicates to you that they'll be coming into the White House with. And the second part, I really want to look, take your views on Middle East policy and what you might recommend, if asked by the next administration, to shape Middle East policy. So let's start with the president-elect, his views, and then a bit on his team. So how do you see Donald Trump in his approach to foreign policy issues, especially as it relates to the Middle East?
I think the president-elect approaches foreign policy and, in fact, a lot of his issues from a position, a mercantilist lens. I think he would say that he is a pragmatist. I think that he tends to view things as a negotiation, as scenarios in which it's difficult and maybe even undesirable to find win-wins. I think he has a desire for the sort of the quick and dirty approach. Certainly his statements tend to lead one in that direction. But overall on foreign policy, I think really two things. I think one, he views foreign policy through different lenses. From his domestic lens, which I think is what he believes to be really the foundation of the mandate, so to speak, that the American people entrusted him with. And then where foreign policy and domestic sort of intersect on security and immigration issues. And then secondly, through the lens of trade, of business, of his mercantilist background. And that things that are peripheral to those issues, I think he's probably had certainly less background, maybe even less time to learn and to think about, and that those issues will probably be seen as an evolving foreign policy.
So does that maybe partly mean that he views his job as mainly, as it were, running America, and that foreign policy is some sort of distant thing, that if it causes a problem for him, security, somebody has to deal with it, or if there's a business opportunity or a trade opportunity, he would pursue it. Most American presidents from the Cold War, even after the Cold War, generally seem to come into office assuming that they're inheriting some kind of global imperial position that they had to hold with allies all over the world, and that they were president of that as well. Do you see a sort of a fundamental difference with Donald Trump?
I do. I'm not sure I ascribe to exactly to your characterization. I think it's a bit simplistic, but I do think this is a president that believes his first responsibility is the domestic problems and our domestic infrastructure, the healthcare issue, the job issues, basically our economy. And whether he leaves foreign policy to another individual, I wouldn't go that far. I would say that his priorities as far as foreign policy issues will be the ones that intersect most dominantly with those core domestic concerns.
Yeah.
Secondly, I do think that his approach to foreign policy thus far as an international businessman have probably been central or centrally around trade and around commercial transactional approaches. And that the larger relationship building, the multilateral aspect of alliances and leveraging alliances against various powers and the deterrence and those kinds of fundamental sort of thesis that underline a lot of our foreign policy are foreign in that they just really don't apply to what his background. So I think for him, that aspect of the U.S. role, whether it's as global policeman, some would argue, or as global benefactor, or the U.S. in decline, where we re-entrench, I don't think this president has had the opportunity to view the U.S. and his role as president in those kinds of contexts.
Interesting. You've been part of, obviously, past administrations. You've witnessed transitions and observed them maybe from the inside and from the outside. So far, he's assembled several members of his national security team. Some of them have contradictory positions on different issues, either contradictory to his or even among themselves. This is not necessarily unprecedented. Different officials and administrations might have varied views. But what do you make of the team so far? What does it reflect about the incoming administration, both in terms of its operation and in terms of its outlook internationally?
Well, I think any kind of real conclusion is premature, given that the national security apparatus and some of the key players still have not been named. The Secretary of State, for instance. Most importantly. Although I think, generally speaking, the candidates have been reassuring. They've all been experienced individuals, either in the diplomatic realm or in the military realm. They're certainly not new to foreign policy and or the bureaucracy in many cases or most cases. After all, part of being the point person, the Secretary of State, is not only being the point of contact and the focal point for your external relations, but it's also sort of governing and herding the cats of your own bureaucracy in order to make those things happen. But certainly Mitt Romney, who was a presidential candidate, a very well-respected governor. You've got David Petraeus, who was very well known, of course, both in his role as CIA director and also his military roles. You have Ambassador Huntsman, et cetera, all very prominent, reassuring. Similarly, with Department of Defense, you have probably one of the most well-respected, one of the most strategic, one of the most combat experience, while on the one hand, while intellectually recognized on the other, General James Mattis, who is thoughtful by all counts, certainly intellectual by all counts, and again, tremendously experienced and knows the bureaucracy to the extent, particularly on the military side. So those are two key places where there's a certain level of comfort.
Well, let me ask about the appointments so far, not so much the individuals, but between the role of the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of Defense, and at some point the Secretary of State, head of CIA, all of these national security positions as they relate to the White House, perhaps through the National Security Advisor. And there are many questions that people have raised about the nominee to National Security Advisor. How do you describe that relationship?
Well, I think that relationship is currently sorting itself out. I mean, General Mike Flynn is new to the national security apparatus per se. He hasn't had a lot of time on the national security staff. And we've seen a lot of different roles. We've seen national security advisors who were really the pinpoint, the point people, and were the ones who whispered in the ear of the president and who had the president's agenda and basically used the national security members as well as the staff in herding the bureaucracy in that direction. We've seen models like the most recent model in the Obama administration where the National Security Council, as well as the staff, became very operational, and actually not only the decision making, but the policy making, and in a lot of cases,
Sort of like a
the
shadow
execution.
State Department. Almost.
Shadow
Yeah.
State Department, I think the military would fairly claim was much too tactically oriented, and may have stepped on the prerogatives of the Secretary of Defense. You have that model.
As well. Yeah.
And I think with the where you've got a national security advisor designate who is mostly tactical experience, who hasn't had the opportunity to demonstrate strategic decision making or strategic leadership of such a bureaucracy. It's his relationship with former higher level officials, in the case of his relationship with the Secretary of Defense. I think will be one that will have to evolve. Certainly, they're both professionals, but it's unusual to have the 3-star versus 4-star, and there is a culture of deference. A lot of generals. I happen to be one of the people that think that turning. Thing, well, no, I think turning over one's national security a little bit. There is a point of view that one has through 20, 30, in some cases 40 years of experience in the military. We all are where we come from. And there's a balance that's historic and for a reason in our country of civilian control over the military and civilian leadership in the foreign policy realm. And right now, there are key positions to be named, but we do have former military as the overall prominent shared characteristic of those appointed.
Having former military in high political positions gets the U.S. closer to the Middle East, so that's a good.
It does.
As in terms of ways of doing things, which is a good segue to your views. If you were to be whispering in the president's president-elect or the president once he becomes president or his team, first of all, in terms of approaching this region, the Middle East. What would your model be? What's the strategic view? In the Cold War, there was certain, competition with the Soviet Union. More recently, it's all been about war on terror. For a while, it was containment of Iran. So it's gone through a lot of stages. Where would you start in the Middle East in terms of formulating the overall challenge before talking about Mosul and Iran and Egypt and specific areas?
I think a two-factored approach, and one is recognition of the decline, and it is a perceived decline in some cases, but perception is reality, particularly in the Middle East. The decline of the ability of the U.S. to exercise leverage due to the perceived decline in our presence, and presence in the most general sense, as well as our credibility in the region.
Well, let me stop right there. Is it a perceived decline that could be changed with new perceptions and new positioning and statements or initiative from the White House, or is it a real power decline that is not just perceptual?
I would say at this point, certainly a lot of it is perception. I think that there's still the opportunity to demonstrate that we are a reliable partner in the region, that we are and will continue to be the dominant extra-regional superpower in the region. That is going to be a very difficult road to travel. Frankly, we've dug ourselves a hole.
But you think that the U.S.
I think there's still opportunity there.
Has interest there, should maintain a certain level of prominence. U.S.
interests have not declined in the region. And in fact, I think with the possible proliferation of nuclear powers and with the democratization, if you will, of weapons of mass destruction and missile programs, and the very real fact that the freedom of navigation in that region of the world is vital. Our interests have not declined. We have not met.
Tended to them.
We have not tended to them well. So there's opportunity there to reverse that trend. I also think, though, that there really is there's a very real reduction of our freedom of action in the region, and part of that is due to our ill-conceived idea, if you take the president at his word in the Atlantic article, to allow or to foster Iranian resurgence, or Iran taking its rightful place, or however you want to describe it in the region. I think if anybody's interests have been diminished, or impacted on that. Certainly U.S. interests have. And then, of course, the bigger issue, which is the lack of credibility and the distrust and the distancing of our important Sunni and other regional allies that believe this to be a zero-sum game, frankly.
Well, you've named a number of very important elements. Let me put the question to you based on that framework. The overall framework with the U.S. has still a lot of interest, if anything, a bit more concerns and interests. There is a perceived or an actual reduction of influence. There is limitations on its ability to be mobile in the area and to move around. What are 3 or 4 things that the incoming administration policies, decisions that relate to key questions, the nuclear deal, Iran's empowerment particularly in the Levant, but also Yemen, 2 different issues maybe.
And even Northern Africa in some respects, or
Northern
Somalia
Africa to some degree. Yeah. And then you said reassuring allies, but what actions will actually reassure them other than phone calls and hand-holding? They want certain things. And the key issue of, the war on ISIS, which continues to be heralded as the main issue, but it goes on and on. I know that's a lot of things, but if you said these are 4 things that I think the next administration should do, what might some of those be?
Well, I think where I would start as step number 1 would be reassurance. And as you insinuated, that has to be engagement at the highest levels. It has to be consultation at the highest levels. And it has to be bringing the Arabs into the tent. One of the things we have been incredibly remiss about is the P5+1, or what P5 construct, however you formulate it, left out the individuals and the countries that were most impacted by our Iranian policy. And that was ultimately, it didn't serve our interests or the region's interests very well.
Absolutely.
So first, engagement to begin the step toward
so start with them.
Thinking with them, sharing ideas. But then you're going to have to show that your real engagement is more than words. And there you need, first and foremost, to be decisive in holding Iran to its obligations, these United Nations obligations outside of the nuclear realm, in its missile program development, as well as the commitment that the president made, I believe at Camp David, but even beside that commitment, the impermissible Iranian involvement in the countries that you've talked about, the deployment of the Quds Force extraterritorially, the increased use of proxies, bad behavior.
Let me pause there.
Okay.
Obviously, Iran has organized militia forces through the Quds and other groups. I mean, Hezbollah was the older original model where it has an army in somebody else's country. It happens to be my home country. And now has informally armies in Syria, in a sense, armies in Iraq, and strong relations with the Houthis in Yemen. What is the mechanism other than, taking a position and saying this is unacceptable? This is a form of military projection of force that Iran has evolved through its Revolutionary Guards and Quds. It has a whole bureaucracy for this. And nobody seems to have, yes, there is ISIS and other crazy groups which fight their own fights, but there is no organized way that I see so far for states to actually push back on Iran's projection of power in this way. Push back on its nuclear program, you can push back on the missile program through clear mechanisms. What is the mechanism to push back on their informal armies that are being projected outside of its border?
Well, I think there's a number of things. There is not going to be a mechanism, which is one of the things we have to sort of get our heads around, that this is a messier region than it has been in the past. It's going to continue to get messy, and that we have to have a certain level of comfort with the some people would say chaos. But there are things that you can do to roll back Iran that we have not done, and one is much more vigor in intercepting, for example, Iranian resupply of the Houthis. And we've done some of that, but it hasn't exactly been an international effort of robust means. Same thing with the support to the Sadrists and the indigenous, we'll call them, Shia movements in Iraq. Some would argue, in fact, that the U.S. Either turned a blind eye or even was complicit in training or acquiescing to Iraqi or Shia demands regarding the involvement of the Shia militia, not only in the activities of Mosul, but in some cases supplying them weapons, supplying them training. Some would argue that we actually trained some of these folks. So being very clear and examining those kinds of activities where we're either complicit or acquiescent and basically fueling or supporting or acknowledging, but letting Iranian support to proxies continue and even strengthen. Having Soleimani, for example, openly direct portions of the battlefield and us acquiescing to that from a coalition standpoint, outrageous. So there are things. There are a number of things. There's not going to be a magic bullet, and it's going to be very small efforts, unfortunately. But what we need to do is have a strategic plan that basically encompasses these kinds of things in order to start rolling Iran back. Number one is we really need to be very careful that we are not an economic supporter of Iran, whether through payment of I don't know how the administration characterized them, but the billions of dollars that went to Iran that arguably went to support the IRGC and the Quds Force and could be used to finance or are being used to finance either direct or indirectly Iranian bad behavior in the region.
But
those kinds of things.
Maybe we didn't mention, but you would be in favor of maintaining the nuclear deal, monitoring it very closely, but not shredding it?
I've avoided that question so far, but I will answer it. My approach, my recommended approach, if I were asked, would be don't pick a fight that you're not going to have to pick until you have to pick it. I think the first and foremost, number one, I'm not clear that the administration, or the new administration, or anybody out for that matter, has seen all the annexes and all the secret and ancillary documents to the deal. So let's make sure that we understand the deal. Number one. Number two, my understanding is that arguably, at least, there have already been Iranian violations of the deal. So let's be clear on that. And if the IAEA or the United Nations or the other participants are unable or unwilling to monitor the deal and to actually ascertain at any given moment whether or not Iran is violating, then we need to fix that.
So in a sense you're saying, well, first of all, we don't know everything, or at least wait for the incoming administration to get all the information, use all the information, levers and so on. If the levers are not working, make sure they're working.
Make sure they're working.
And then if there really is violations, judge it accordingly. Is that sort of maybe
judge it accordingly? I have no doubt that as Iranian activity in the missile development realm, or in the weapons testing realm, or in other realms, if not a violation, certainly there were German reports about transfer. I have no doubt that the Iranians either have, are, or will violate the agreement. And at the point in which you call them on it, or at the point in which their other bad behavior, ancillary to the agreement, forces you to go to the United Nations and go to the allies and say, wait, while technically the agreement has not been violated, this agreement is being used as a pass on other violations. And then you go through that route, because that way you deal with the other signatories. Frankly, at that point, it seems to me Iran has been very clear. If you're going to call me on my other violations and my other bad behavior that are in direct conflict with international law, well, then I'm going to walk away from the agreement anyway. And frankly, I think they'll do it for you.
Yeah, interesting. We're running out of time.
I apologize.
I want to ask one final question unrelated to Iran, which is the situation in Libya.
Sure.
The U.S. was involved in the operations with the European friends and so on, and we have the situation that we have now. Iran not involved in that arena. It's very close to Europe, very close to the West. Obviously,
Yep.
could have serious security and immigration challenges. What can a new administration do to stabilize the situation, different to what the previous administration or the outgoing administration has done? What are the levers that the U.S. might have there?
Well, unfortunately, if we could roll back time, I think the U.S. would have considerable levers that are no longer useful in Libya. I just came from the Mediterranean dialogue that was sponsored by the Italian government and the EU, in which actually Libya and the immigration problem across the Med was one of the central focus. Interestingly, it was widely discussed that the Europeans are not only worried about the immigrants or the refugees, but also worried about Russia moving closer to Libya in order to gain a foothold in the Mediterranean basin. But Libya is a troubled country of a number of militia with a very dynamic, volatile, and violent situation. And frankly, I'm not sure the U.S. has much leverage to shape events there.
So it might be more necessarily a European.
Well, we left it to the
Europe first,
Europeans
and
the
that didn't
first
work out
times,
too
and that
well,
didn't
yeah.
work out real well. And the Libyans will tell you, I was on the ground in Libya, both before and after Benghazi, about every couple times a year, and we missed a tremendous opportunity where the Libyans actually would approach you in the street and ask you, ask the U.S. to help. I still think there's a certain amount of that left, but the Libyans will tell you they're not done fighting. And we need to work more closely with our Gulf allies and the Libyans themselves and the Egyptians to make sure that we are providing the support to whatever national movement, certainly not one of the movements that are militia-driven, and are, quite frankly, gained the economic driver of all of this, which is control over the oil fields. Libyan control, of course, and using that lever to
Unify things.
Build
some stability.
Yeah, that would be my
Well,
recommendation.
thank you very much, Mary-Beth.
It's been a
We
pleasure,
had more
Paul.
time. There's tons to talk about. General Mattis is already Secretary of Defense. Otherwise, I would have nominated you for that position. But,
Thank you. Thank you. I'm actually looking for Emperor of the Universe.
Empress, okay.
Empress?
We'll make some calls. Mary-Beth, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you all for following, and we'll see you at the next webcast.